Most towns live quiet, predictable lives. People wake up, go to work, come home, cook dinner, sleep, and do it again the next day. Kalachi was one of those places. A tiny village in northern Kazakhstan with a few hundred residents. A school, a post office, and endless open fields. A place where nothing strange ever happened, and nobody expected anything to change. Then, in 2013, something did. It began with a man riding his bicycle home. A normal afternoon, nothing unusual. He was pedaling along a familiar dirt road when he suddenly felt a strange heaviness push into his body. His vision wavered for a moment, like heat rising off asphalt. He blinked, shook his head, kept riding. Then the world tilted. He collapsed sideways into the grass, still holding the handlebars, already unconscious before he even hit the ground. He didn't wake up for 3 days. Doctors couldn't explain it. His scans were clean. His blood work looked normal. No toxins, no stroke, no trauma. When he finally opened his eyes, he asked what day it was. He thought he'd only been asleep for a few minutes. They sent him home with no answers and no explanation. Everyone assumed it was a one-time medical event. Until a woman collapsed inside the local shop. She'd been talking with the cashier when her speech slowed, her eyes lost focus, and she slumped against the counter as if someone had unplugged her. She didn't respond when they shook her. She didn't react when they tried to wake her with cold water. She slept for nearly 4 days. Then a teenage boy fell asleep during class and didn't wake up until the following evening. Then an elderly man fell asleep on his porch. Then a farmer dropped his tools and collapsed into the dirt without a sound. 2 cases could be coincidence. 10 cases could be a problem. But in Kalachi, dozens of people suddenly began falling into deep, unnatural sleep. Men, women, children, the young, the old. No pattern, no warning, no explanation. And they didn't faint. They entered something far deeper. A sleep so heavy that shouting didn't wake them. Pain didn't wake them. Hospital equipment didn't wake them. They breathed normally. Their hearts beat normally. But their minds were gone, locked away for days. Some slept for 2 days, some for 4, some for nearly a week. A few slept for 8 days straight. And when they finally opened their eyes, they woke up confused, anxious, disoriented. Some had no memory of collapsing. Others remembered strange, vivid dreams that felt too real to dismiss. A woman said she dreamt non-stop for 3 days. A boy woke up screaming, claiming he saw enormous cats prowling around him. A man said he dreamed of drowning in black water, sinking deeper and deeper, unable to fight it. As more cases appeared, fear began to spread through the village. People stopped driving. Parents walked their children to school instead of trusting them to go alone. Workers took breaks every few minutes to check if they felt dizzy. Nobody trusted sleep. Nobody trusted their body to stay awake. Doctors arrived from nearby towns. Then scientists arrived from cities farther away. Then journalists began showing up because nobody could explain what was happening. The story didn't fit into anything people understood. A cluster of spontaneous comas in a remote village? No poison, no virus, no chemical spill? It sounded impossible. Scientists tested everything: soil samples, water samples, air quality, radiation, mold spores, heavy metals, pesticides, carbon monoxide, methane, radon. They measured environmental levels inside people's homes, outside in the fields, in schools, in barns, in wells. They checked crops, dust, livestock feed. Everything looked normal, but the villagers kept collapsing. One afternoon, 8 people fell asleep within 3 hours. A mother carrying groceries collapsed on her front steps. A young girl fell asleep while playing outside. An elderly man fell asleep leaning on his cane. A local shopkeeper fell asleep mid-sentence with a customer. The hospital struggled to handle the flood of unconscious villagers. Beds filled up. Mattresses were placed on the floor. Nurses walked between rows of sleeping residents who breathed softly and showed no signs of waking. Some people twitched when dreaming. Others lay still for days. When some finally woke up, they had difficulty standing. Some forgot where they lived. Some didn't recognize familiar faces. One man insisted someone had been standing beside his bed the entire time he slept. A woman said she woke up crying because she couldn't distinguish what was real anymore and what had been hallucinated during the long sleep. Despite everything, many showed perfectly normal neurological scans. No infection, no injury, no poison, no explanation. Scientists began to focus on one thing: the abandoned Soviet uranium mine a short distance from Kalachi. The mine had been shut down in the 1990s, left to rot underground. A massive network of tunnels, collapsing supports, old equipment, and unknown gas pockets. Some suspected carbon monoxide leaking from the mine. Others thought radon gas might be drifting toward the village under certain weather conditions. But carbon monoxide poisoning usually causes headaches, nausea, confusion. It doesn't cause people to sleep peacefully for days. And radon doesn't cause sudden collapse. Nothing fit. Yet the events continued. A woman folding laundry in her backyard suddenly dropped the sheet she was holding and collapsed into the grass. A farmer feeding his cows fell asleep so abruptly that he slumped into a bucket of water. A man riding his motorcycle collapsed and skidded into a fence. By the second year, more than 100 villagers had experienced the strange sleep. Some had episodes multiple times. A few collapsed 5 or 6 times over the course of months, terrified every time that they wouldn't wake up again. Parents watched their children constantly. People stopped going anywhere alone. Residents walked around with a deep fear sitting behind every blink. Because the most frightening part wasn't the sleep itself. It was the moment right before, when they felt consciousness slipping away and realized they were powerless to stop it. One man described it perfectly. It felt like something heavy pressing on my brain, like someone else was deciding that it was time for me to sleep. Life in Kalachi became a waiting game. People dreaded the dizziness that could hit at any moment. Some described tasting metal. Others described a sudden fog rolling into their thoughts. But for many, there was no warning at all. They would be mid-conversation, mid-movement, mid-thought, and then they were gone. The government eventually stepped in and began offering relocation to safer towns. Many residents accepted the offer and left, but others refused. Some were too old to move. Some had livestock and farms they couldn't abandon. Some didn't trust the government's explanation. Some simply hoped things would return to normal. The episodes continued anyway. And then, without warning, the pattern began to slow. By late 2014, fewer villagers were collapsing. By 2015, only a handful of new cases appeared. Then, eventually, no new cases at all. The sleeping sickness faded as mysteriously as it had arrived. But the village didn't relax. People didn't celebrate. They didn't believe it was over. They waited, every day, every night, waiting for someone else to collapse, for another child to fall asleep on the playground, for another farmer to sink into unconsciousness in the middle of feeding his animals. The quiet felt unnatural, like the calm after a storm that hasn't completely passed. Families who had stayed behind lived with the constant fear that the sickness was still hiding somewhere, moving silently through the air or water, waiting for the right moment to strike again. People woke up in the middle of the night and checked their children repeatedly. Others sat upright in bed whenever they felt a headache coming on, terrified it was the beginning of another long sleep. Doctors kept returning to Kalachi long after the last official episode. They interviewed villagers, collected samples, and tried to find patterns. Some experts insisted that the culprit had been gas from the abandoned mine. They argued that under specific conditions, a certain mix of temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind direction, carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons might have drifted into the village and caused a mass poisoning. But the theory never fully matched what happened. Carbon monoxide poisoning leaves traces in the blood, and many villagers didn't show levels high enough to explain days of coma-like sleep. And even if the gas drifted toward Kalachi, why did the episodes come and go in waves instead of hitting everyone at once? Why did some people collapse repeatedly while others never experienced anything at all? Other scientists suggested that radon gas could have been the cause. Radon is odorless and invisible, and long-term exposure can have neurological consequences. But radon doesn't usually cause sudden unconsciousness. It also didn't explain the hallucinations villagers experienced right before collapsing, or the non-stop dream states some described after waking up. A few researchers proposed a theory involving groundwater contamination. They believed that chemicals trapped in underground layers near the old mine might have seeped into the village's water supply intermittently. But water tests never showed anything unusual. And even if contamination happened, why did it affect people so differently? Why would one person collapse 5 times while their spouse never experienced a single symptom? In interview after interview, villagers were asked what they remembered right before falling asleep. Their answers were unsettlingly similar. Some felt their thoughts stretching, slowing, becoming thick and heavy like syrup. Others said the world felt distant and muffled, as if they were hearing everything through a wall. A few said they heard ringing in their ears. Many described a metallic taste coating their tongues. A girl said the colors around her looked too bright right before the darkness came. A man said he felt his mind drifting out of his head while his body remained behind. Doctors struggled to categorize the symptoms. It didn't behave like a virus, a toxin, or a neurological disorder. It didn't follow the patterns seen in mass hysteria or psychological events, because people were collapsing while completely alone, and even young children, too young to understand fear or suggestion, fell victim to it. Government officials eventually announced that the episodes had been caused by carbon monoxide and hydrocarbon gases leaking from the old mine. It was the simplest explanation. But even the scientists who supported the theory admitted in private interviews that they couldn't prove it, and that the evidence wasn't consistent. Still, the mine became the official cause, simply because no one else had anything better. Villagers didn't buy it. They knew what carbon monoxide poisoning looked like. They knew how fast and violently it struck. What they experienced felt different. People didn't vomit or convulse or lose consciousness suddenly with gasping breaths. They drifted into sleep quietly, as if someone had slowly lowered a curtain over their minds. By 2016, the government had relocated most of Kalachi's remaining residents. Houses were abandoned, schools emptied, shops closed. The silence that took over the village wasn't peaceful or calm. It felt hollow, like a place that had been drained of life by something nobody could see. The people who experienced the sleeping sickness carried the psychological scars long after the episodes stopped. Some developed insomnia because they were afraid of going to sleep at night. Others woke up in panic, even years later, convinced for a moment that they had fallen into another long sleep. Children who had collapsed in class refused to nap, terrified that they wouldn't wake up. A man who had been affected multiple times said he didn't trust his own senses anymore. He felt that sleep was no longer a choice, but something that could capture him without warning. Even the individuals who never collapsed were traumatized. Parents lived with the constant memory of watching their children fall into unconsciousness with no way to wake them. Spouses remembered shaking their partners, screaming their names, calling emergency services, while their loved ones lay perfectly still. One woman said she spent every moment for 2 years listening for sounds outside her window, afraid the sickness was returning. She described it as living with a shadow standing behind her, silent, but always present. After the village emptied out, the buildings began to decay. Houses sagged, paint peeled, windows cracked. The landscape around Kalachi swallowed the silence. The place became a ghost town, with more questions than answers. Scientists still visited occasionally, walking through abandoned rooms where beds were left unmade, toys were left on floors, dishes still sat in sinks. It looked like people had simply vanished overnight, even though the truth was much slower and far more unsettling. The abandoned mine remained sealed. The government monitored the area for a few years, but eventually interest faded. The world moved on. Other news stories replaced Kalachi. Other mysteries took the spotlight. But for the people who lived through it, the experience never faded. They remembered the heaviness behind their eyes, the feeling of sinking, the dreams that wouldn't stop. They remembered waking up, confused and terrified. They remembered losing days of their lives, like torn out pages. Many said the scariest part wasn't collapsing. It wasn't the dreams or the hallucinations. It wasn't even the fact that science never found a real cause. The scariest part was that nothing felt different the day before an episode. The air didn't smell strange. The sky didn't look unusual. There was no warning, no reason, no visible threat. One day you were awake. The next day you were gone. And then you woke up with the sense that something had passed through you. Something you couldn't name. Something you couldn't see. Something that left no trace except the memory of darkness and the fear that it could happen again. Kalachi became known as Sleepy Hollow, the real one, the one without ghosts or legends, the one where the danger wasn't a creature or a curse, but something that touched the deepest vulnerability humans have: sleep. Even now, years later, scientists studying the case describe it as one of the strangest, unexplained mass medical events ever recorded. They have data, theories, interviews, environmental readings, but not an answer. The people who collapsed can describe their dreams in perfect detail, but not what caused them. The world watched an entire community fall unconscious again and again, and no one could stop it. And the phenomenon ended the same way it began, silently, without explanation, without logic, without closure. Thanks for listening.